Hey guys, today I want to tell you about a super fun build I've been using on Hunter that basically just gives you a ridiculous amount of damage resistance so that you can just face tank anything in any difficulty. Basically, this is using damage resistance stacking on Prismatic Hunter specifically to work. So we'll get into all these sources and how consistent they are because they actually have really good uptime considering the amount that you can get. So yeah, let's get into it. So the first thing I want to talk about is what actually makes this build so good and where does all this damage resistance come from? Well, it comes from a lot of different sources, but the biggest one that I can think of is going to be the Pseudarachne's Facade on the class item. You can use the baseline version of Pseudarachne's if you don't have it as well, but it is significantly better on the class item than it is on the exotic itself, because the exotic itself only works with grapple, but whenever you have the class item version on, you can proc it using Gunpowder Gamble as well as Prismatic Grenades. The class item version also means you aren't limited to which grenade you can use, however I still prefer to use grapples anyway since they have the best uptime, and they have a lot of benefits on Hunter like counting as a melee. The next source on the list comes from the Facet of Purpose, and we're using a Stasis Super with this setup so that way we can get Frost Armor for additional damage resistance. You could also go with Golden Gun to get Restoration instead from Orbs, which is also pretty great for staying alive, and it stacks better with damage resistance than more damage resistance does, because damage resistance is actually a diminishing effect. Basically, this means as you stack on more damage resistance, each individual source is going to be worth less and less than it would be if it was on its own. This issue doesn't happen with Restoration because it's not actually a damage resistance source, it's just restoring your health. But I can't lie, I was using Stasis so I could have the 94% damage resist thumbnail. That said, I still think there's some real benefits to it, like the Stasis Super being quite a bit better than Golden Gun when it comes to doing general content like GMs. Celestial kind of changes that, but just on its own, Golden Gun isn't really that good. At least when it comes to roam content, and that's really what this build is for. There's no reason to invest this heavily into survivability whenever you need to do something like raid DPS. You'd want to invest in that instead. But this is a really fun way to just absolutely destroy difficult content by being effectively invincible. In fact, if you go into easier content and you use this kind of damage resistance, you'll actually find the enemies not even damaging your bar at all, you just aren't taking any damage. And you're even able to heal through it if you took some damage before and then activated it and were being shot at. And I might be wrong in this assumption, but I want to say that the damage is so small that it's not even enough to cause a visible change in your health bar. But getting back on topic, let's go ahead and look at the build. We'll start things off with looking at the exotic, and we are going to be using the exotic class item for this. I already kind of explained it earlier, but basically you want to have the Spirit of Pseudarachne, but if you don't have anything with Pseudarachne right now, then just use regular Pseudarachne. The build still definitely works. As for the third column perk to run with Pseudarachne, I would use Inmost Light. This is just even more ability uptime, which is super good for this build because it is very ability spammy. Unfortunately, mine doesn't have that because I didn't win at gambling, so I had Spirit of Galanor on instead, which works like half the time sometimes, so that's an alternative as well. But I would say that Inmost Light is the consistently most useful perk in the third column otherwise. Now looking at the actual subclass, like I also said earlier, you could choose between either Stasis or Solar. If you're using a kinetic weapon instead of an elemental weapon like I am in the video, then I would suggest using a subclass that matches the surges for the activity you're going into, and then if there are no surges, then just use whatever you want. That way your kinetic weapon gets the bonus damage from having a matching subclass. But also bear in mind that using a weapon like an SMG or a sniper that already has barrier or some other thing on the artifact boosting it, that will apply the surge buff as well, so you can use that instead of having it be surge matching or matching your element on your subclass. That's why I was able to get away with using Stasis in the footage here. Then from there, we can go with our grenade and melee. I would highly recommend the grapple. It's pretty much just the best grenade on Hunter in my opinion overall. As for the melee, you've got two main choices. I used Threaded Spike in the footage, but you could also use the Shurikens instead. They are very good at doing overload if there's overloads, but the strike I was in didn't have overload, so I just used that for some additional Sever. Sever is pretty nice, and it kind of just counts as another form of damage resistance as well, so it is super good. As for the dodge, you'd obviously want Gambler's Dodge for more ability spam. For the aspects, we're actually doing something a little different. Most of the time you just use Stylish and Winter's Shroud in most general builds, but in this one we're actually using Stylish with Gunpowder Gamble. Gunpowder Gamble actually contributes to this build pretty well in that throwing Gunpowder Gamble does proc Woven Mail as long as you're using the class item version of Pseudarachne. On top of that, Gunpowder Gamble is just kind of good. It's a very nice way to get a lot of ag clear, and it's also able to stun unstopped champs in a pinch pretty quickly. It's actually the main reason I chose to use a primary in the video. I know I could have used a trace rifle or something, but I mean SMGs were just already barrier and I didn't want to match my subclass, so I just decided to go with an SMG here. And it just makes it super easy to shoot the gunpowder gamble whenever I want to. If you are facing overloads and not facing unstops, then I could see a reason to use Winter's Shroud still, but Gunpowder Gamble does add some to the build uniquely, so I like to run it. Then getting into the fragments, this is where things get a little bit interesting. The first obvious one is going to be Facet of Protection. This should be on literally every prismatic build ever pretty much, unless it's for super easy content. It's literally just free damage resistance, it's so good, and it's just so versatile and able to work in any situation. I would always have this equipped. Next up, I would use Facet of Dawn. You get a ton of melee hits with this build, as you always do in pretty much any hunter build, and so getting Radiant for that is great. Then I would use Facet of Hope. This is basically just the one-stop shop for having constant melee uptime. It makes your dodges go faster, so you can do more Gambler's dodges, which equals more melees. Next up, of course, Facet of Purpose. We kind of already talked about this. Basically, this is the healing verb depending on your super. This is one of the best survivability fragments in the entire game, let alone on Prismatic, so I highly recommend having it in the majority of builds. Maybe not if you're using an Arc or a Void super though. And this leaves us with one more fragment slot. And there are a couple of things you could do with this. There's no super important one for this slot, so I would leave this as a flex slot like I think any good build has. And for that slot, I would probably go with either Facet of Solitude, Facet of Blessing, or maybe even Facet of Ruin, especially if you're using Silence and Squall. Bear in mind that that'll also make the explosion on Gunpowder Gamble bigger because it is an ignition. One more unique thing you could use in this slot is actually Facet of Bravery, which can give you Unraveling and Volatile rounds. If you guys didn't know, getting a kill with Grapple actually gives you both at the same time if you're using weapons that are compatible. So you can see in the loadout here, I just happen to have a Strand SMG and a Void Sword, so I put it on for some fun. I probably would have gotten more value out of something like Facet of Ruin, but it was pretty cool to have some Unraveling rounds and some Volatile rounds going on at the same time. And now let's go ahead and talk about weapons. Quite a bit earlier into TFS, I did make a video about this build, or a build similar to this for GMs specifically. However, it was very heavily reliant on using Ergo Sum with Arc Conductor, so I wanted to work it into something that's a little bit more versatile, that can be changed to fit your needs better, and might work with a better variety of weapons, so that's why I made this. And you can see I am using Ergo Sum in the video, but I'm actually using the Polaris Caster roll for damage instead of the Arc Conductor one that I used to use for ag clearing. And I think it worked out pretty well. It was able to do ignitions, which could stop unstops, but you could really adapt this build to anything that you want to. I would just recommend it be a relatively aggressive build. You're not really getting any use out of extreme damage resistance if you're just sitting in the back of the map with Outbreak blinking anyway. So shotguns, swords, all that, get in their face and make use of how aggressive you can be. But I'll have the weapons I used in the build link in the description. And really quickly before we go, I want to actually tell you guys about a little something going on in the channel. I am working on a John LFG video. If you guys don't know who John LFG is, that's basically my Guardian Rank 2 account. And I've been developing it into the most powerful Guardian Rank 2 in the entire world. The progression system in Destiny is really confusing because there's a bunch of weird restrictions whenever you're not above Guardian Rank 5, like not having access to weapon and armor mods and stuff like that, and Guardian Rank 4 with not being able to get the full builds for the light subclasses. But I do have access to all of the dark subclasses fully, as well as Prismatic fully unlocked, and all the meta weapons of course as well. So it's basically just a really weird handicapped account that I have a ton of fun with, just messing around in LFGs with, and I'm gonna have a video about him coming out here pretty soon, probably the next video after this one actually. There's not really a lot to do in the game right now, so stuff like this is a good way for me to have fun, and I hope that it brings you guys some enjoyable content as well. If you are looking forward to seeing that, make sure you subscribe so that you can get a notification once I release it. And I'd love to hear you guys' feedback in the comments down below. I actually get a notification on my phone every time somebody sends a comment, and I do read all of them. Anyway, that's enough e-bagging from me. That's it for the video. Bye-bye.